The second issue of our monographic series reflects on the project of Landscape as Urbanism in the Americas, led by Charles Waldheim and the Office for Urbanization at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Curated together with Mercedes Peralta and Jeannette Sordi, NESS.docs 2 explores the potentials for landscape as a medium of urban intervention in the specific context of Latin American cities.
More than 20 Latin American practices are shown and grouped in 5 different themes:
biological environments, resilient grounds, performative systems, revealed protocols, and assembled natures. Finally, a conversation between Charles Waldheim, Florencia Rodriguez, and Luis Callejas deepens the discussion about academic curricula, drawing as representation, political spaces, and the general sensitivity around landscape.
Get your copy today and enjoy the reading.
Hi everybody, and thank you for joining us today in our first online event. I'm Pablo Gerson, partner and founder of Lots of Architecture Publishers. Together with Florencia Rodriguez, we started this venture back in 2017, and we're really proud of what we've accomplished so far. This year, Max Rom is joining us as a third partner, so welcome Max. It is a great pleasure for me to present this event. And before we start, I would like to take a time to thank Charles Waldheim for sharing with us his research and experience on landscape as urbanism, which he led from the Office for Urbanization at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Also, Jeannette Sordi and Mercedes Peralta, the co-editors along with Florencia, for working so much on this. I also want to specially mention the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies and express our gratefulness for their immense support. We want to take this opportunity to acknowledge our team for the work and continuous efforts adapting to new conditions and doing it so well. So thank you Isabella Moretti, our editor-in-chief, Magdalena Tagliabue, who acted as executive editor in this issue, Natalia Laporta, who is in charge of all the other visual content we produce, our editors, Santiago Bogani and Lisa Nodan, our design team, Santiago Pacero and Ignacio Espert, and René Carmichael, who is our web editor and was responsible for putting this online event together. They all share our enthusiasm for new challenges. Right now, we are working on the third issue of NESS that will print in the fall and also in a book collection to be presented next year. One last acknowledgement to all the contributors and practices featured in NESS for trusting us to communicate your amazing work and ideas. I will leave the string with Magda now. She will guide you through this event. And remember, we always love to hear from you. So, thanks and enjoy.
Hello everyone, I'm Magdalena Tagliabue, editor at NESS. I'm happy to welcome you to the first NESS Talk, a format of conversation that we inaugurate today and expect to transform into a series. NESS and Lots of Architecture Publishers are pleased to present here the second issue of our monographic series, NESS.docs 2, Landscape as Urbanism in the Americas. As Pablo already mentioned, the issue reflects on the project led by Charles Waldheim and the Office for Urbanization at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, and was done with support from the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies. Curated by Florencia Rodriguez, Mercedes Peralta, and Jeannette Sordi, it explores the potential for landscape as a medium for urban intervention in the specific context of Latin American cities. It is the first publication to gather so many Latin American practices working in the field of landscape, and that is particularly significant for us as a team. Today, we will be listening to some of the practices featured in the publication while fostering dialogues that we hope can trigger and expand future discussions on the theme. After this, Marcela Ramos, Arts Program Manager at the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard University, will make a short introduction. She will be followed by Charles Waldheim, who will expand on the idea of landscape as urbanism, which will be a theoretical introduction to the panels. Charles Waldheim is an architect, urbanist, and educator. He's the Sean A. Irving Professor of Landscape Architecture at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design, where he directs the Office for Urbanization. After this, I will introduce you the panels. Questions and comments are welcome throughout the event, and they will be answered at the end of each panel. You can write them in the Q&A window in Zoom. We will then make a selection and read them so the speakers can answer. If you would like to comment more generally with panelists and the audience, you can also use the chat. Please enjoy the event. We invite you to become part of the conversation on Instagram with the hashtag NESS.docs too. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Pablo and Magdalena and the whole team for giving me the opportunity to tell you why I'm here today. My name is Marcela Ramos. I'm the program manager for the Arts, Film and Culture program at the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard. One key role of the center is to provide support and resources for students, faculty, and scholars working in and on Latin America. And that's why we've been involved with this project, the Landscape as Urbanism in the Americas initiative, led by Professor Waldheim, since its beginning many years ago, almost 4 years ago, actually. The initiative has received support from the center, from our faculty grants program, from the Dr. Class Regional Office in Chile, and from our Arts, Film and Culture program. We help coordinate collaborations with local institutions and put together events in Chile, Argentina, Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia over the past 4 years. You will see a link on the chat to our center, to our website, in which you can find more information about us and about the event and the initiative with all the events in the different countries. I know many of the scholars and institutions who participated in these events over the years are here today, and I wanted to thank them, especially NESS, whom we started this collaboration when we had this event in Buenos Aires. And finally, and most importantly for us also, is to thank our graduate students and alumni at this point who were key in putting this together. And especially I want to thank personally Felipe Vera and Jeannette Sordi, with whom we started this 4 years ago. Finally, just to end, I want to, besides thanking all the participants as well, to tell you that we look forward to seeing you all next year at Harvard. Hopefully we'll host our event that was planned for spring this year and obviously could not happen. So we look forward to that and to discuss these topics so important for our Latin American cities at Harvard with all of you next year. Thank you.
Thanks, Marcela, and thanks everyone for joining. First of all, let me say, I hope that all of you, I hope your family, your friends, your loved ones are staying well these days. These are challenging times, I know, everywhere in the world. If anything comes out of this recent past is the sense that we're sharing this together. I know we've all had enormous challenges over the past decades, economic crises, political crises, environmental challenges, and they persist, those challenges. But ultimately, I'm confident when I've seen people respond really around the world to the challenges that we're confronting. So first of all, our thoughts are with you and with your family and with your loved ones. I don't want to repeat all the acknowledgements that have been given. I want to keep my remarks informal and brief to kind of open and really welcome and receive this event. But I would be remiss without beginning with my acknowledgements to Florencia Rodriguez and her team at NESS, Pablo, Magda, everyone at NESS.docs has been really extraordinary as partners in this project. They were engaged very early on in this process. Equally, Marcela and the entire crew at the David Rockefeller Center have been extraordinarily generous, in addition to the leadership of the Graduate School of Design. So Dean Sarah Whiting, Dean Mohsen Mostafavi. I also want to acknowledge the key role that the co-editors, Jeannette, Sordi, and Mercedes Peralta played in conceiving of this volume. For those of you that haven't seen it, it's an extraordinary piece of work. And I say that with all humility, not because of anything that I contributed to it, which was in fact quite little, but rather as a kind of document of the research that's been going on in the region, and that I think Mercedes and Jeannette and Florencia as a team really kind of crystallized in their editorial approach, in their curatorial choices, and in the document. I'm hopeful that you'll see it equally. As Marcela mentioned, this initiative really began with an opening about 5 years ago. In 2014, my colleagues and I from the GSD, we were on a tour. We were in Santiago de Chile, we were in Sao Paulo in Brazil, and we were in conversations about the future of these cities and with our friends and our alumni and our colleagues there. And out of those conversations, which were really very broad about the conditions in Latin America, a couple of things became clearer to me in a way, and that were the impetus in some ways for this process. The first that I would mention are a set of historical processes, let's say, beginning in the final years of the 20th century, continuing into the 21st century, but a noted shift across the region, acknowledging that there are enormous differences between cultures, between countries, between people's different experiences in different parts of the region. What became clearer to me in the narratives that people were sharing with me was that this region had been moving, generally speaking, away from forms of oppression and toward forms of democracy. There are challenges there. There is ongoing work there. Of course, this is not resolved. It's not finished history. But the first vector was a tendency generally in the region toward forms of democratization, forms of citizen participation, and forms of representative governance. Another clear vector that's been with us for the past 20, 25 years in the region has been a series of economic transformations, both positive and negative, frankly, which you might think of as regional integration, forms of integration in part fueled by trade agreements and flexible labor relationships. Again, not all positive things, but a tendency toward interconnectedness, trade, openness. I use the example of the airline industry as one evidence of this. Over those 20 or 25 years, the airline industry in the region has tended to move away from state-based, state-owned enterprises servicing their population. And I would joke that it would be easier to go from Colombia back to Miami to then fly to Brazil than to go from Colombia to Brazil. But over the past couple of decades, increasingly, low-cost and startup airlines increased interconnection, increased economic exchange within the region. And of course, wide disparities, highly uneven development across the populations in these various places, but generally a tendency toward greater connectivity, greater both economic and therefore social integration. And then the third tendency was a broader awareness of the importance of the natural environment across cultures. Again, uneven, ongoing work, obviously more work to be done. But in principle, in the cities that we were touring across Latin America, across the cone, we saw cultures that were aware of environmental challenges, increasingly identifying environmental awareness and challenges going forward. So those were broad political, economic, societal changes. The other thing that became clear to me was in our conversations with our colleagues and friends across the region, that there was a slight shift in attitude relative to landscape as a medium or landscape as a field. Now, this was in contrast to many of my previous experiences in Latin America, where the strong architect position was really the dominant cultural position about the city. The architect designed everything from flatware on the dinner table through to the scale of the airport. And there was a dominant, I would say, kind of European cultural inheritance in which landscape was perceived, broadly speaking, to be outside the city. Again, that's a broad generalization. I'm happy to chat with you further about it. But in principle, again, in the past 2 decades, what I've seen across Latin America, across different cultures, are a couple of tendencies within respect to the design disciplines. The first of those are a generation now of architects and urbanists who have been trained in the exterior, have been trained in Europe, been trained in North America, and they have been exposed in those places to thinking about natural environments or thinking about ecology as a driver of design in a slightly different valence or a slightly different orbit. That generation of many of them have returned to the region, many of them are teaching, many of them have open practices. And so we now have a generation or more, maybe even a generation or two, that have been sensitized to biological models and metaphors for urban work or for architectural project making. Second tendency in the design fields that we saw was a tendency for commissions, for projects, for clients, for municipalities to shift their focus toward environmental remediation, the transformation of abandoned airports for parkland, the remediation of rivers, the focusing on the growth boundary of the city. So we had a range of projects across the region that were dealing with environmental drivers in a broad sense. And then finally was the emergence, uneven, nascent as it is, in certain cultures of distinct programs in landscape within schools of architecture, or in some cases actually proper fully degree programs in landscape architecture. Now there are enormous differences between those, but what became clear to us 5 years ago was that there was a sufficient shift in this regard over the past couple of decades that we might be able to begin to describe that. In that regard, the thing that we would stress is in our work, we've prioritized working with and communicating with the local institutions, the local actors, the universities on the ground, the local municipalities, the local practices. And so in that regard, our work is very much one of listening. And what you see in the NESS.docs volume, really, frankly, is a kind of an attempt to curate that, to really organize that material and to say, here's what we've found. Not so much from Cambridge, actually, but rather from our conversations with our friends in the region. It was indeed Felipe Vera's proposition to me 5 years ago that we should do something with Marcela and David Rockefeller Center's support and support of the GSD to convene conversations. So beginning 5 years ago, we started, we've been in Medellin, we've been in Santiago, we've been in Brasilia, we've been in Mexico City, we've been in Buenos Aires, of course. And over 5 years of this process, we now have a format of convening conversations amongst people across the design fields, sharing these interests, and with a sense that if we're successful, we'll be able to produce really a new language. I'm not convinced that the language that we have today is adequate. You'll see in the NESS.docs publication a first attempt that I think is well orchestrated and well curated. But having said that, I feel very strongly that the conditions, the economic, the political, the territorial, the social in Latin America are producing a new kind of practice, a new set of responses in which the medium of landscape is being seen to be not outside the city, but quite firmly as a medium of design within the city and as a process of urbanization itself. And in that regard, of course, the architects and urbanists that we've convened have contributed quite a lot to that conversation. So in addition to Felipe Vera, of course, Jeannette Sordi, Pedro Aparicio, Helen Kongsgaard from our team, we convened a conversation beginning 5 years ago that was supported by our friends across the region, including many of our guests today, Luis Callejas, Alfredo Ramirez, Romy Hecht, Ciro Nali, Alejandra Echeverri, and the list goes on and on. Too many, frankly, to mention in my brief remarks here. But let me say again, thank you for joining us. I hope that you and your people are staying well these days. We do look forward to welcoming you to Cambridge, actually, not virtually, in 2021 when we hope to convene this conference. And it's my pleasure to be here and to listen and to learn and to encourage you. Please be in touch. We'll share with you our email and our Office for Urbanization website in the chat. And we'll look forward to hearing from you later today. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcela and Charles. Now it is time for our first panel. Mercedes Peralta will talk with Ana María Durán and Martín Cobas. Mercedes Peralta is an architect, designer, and is currently a research associate at the Harvard Graduate School of Design Office for Urbanization. In addition to her professional diploma in architecture from the University of Buenos Aires, she holds an MA degree at the Certificate in Media and Modernity from the Princeton School of Architecture. María Durán is an architect who teaches at the Yale School of Architecture. She's completing a PhD at the University of California, Los Angeles. She holds a master's degree from the University of Pennsylvania, and she has been teaching for almost 20 years at the Pontificia Universidad Católica del Ecuador. Martín Cobas is an architect and now a PhD candidate at the Princeton University School of Architecture. He's also chair of the History of Architecture at the FADU, Universidad de la República Montevideo. He has taught in Argentina, Brazil, Ecuador, and the US. Cobas holds a master's degree in design studies in history and theory of design from Harvard's GSD, and is a member of the South American project at the Harvard Davis Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies.
Hello. Thank you. Thanks, Magda, for the introduction. If you hear me well, we'll give the start to our first panel. I'd like to thank you, María and Martín, for being here and joining us. I'm glad to share a conversation with both of you, and I'd rather also make a very informal warm-up start of our conversation by just reading very briefly two extracts from the publication. The first one appears in Ana Maria's contribution, Breeding Urban Ecologies, and the second is the general description of Fábrica de Paisajes agenda, which I'd like to use both as pieces that could work as a point of departure to land on a couple of questions and themes, which I'd like both Ana and Martín to build a little bit upon. First one, Latin America is experiencing eco, geno, and epistemicide in its hinterlands. While it constructs landscape urbanisms in applied to vindicate within urban centers the necessity to restore and care for the ecologies that enlightened Wallace, Darwin, Humboldt, and other scientists, ecologies that pose within and beyond the city and that are being suffocated by extraction and one of its many negative externalities, massive displacement of people, and the explosion of informal mantles. The case studies presented here are statements on alternative pathways towards well-being, with humans not as centerpieces, but as partners in a web of life. The agenda of Fábrica de Paisaje is based on three action codes: fiction, distance, and beauty. All three are firmly anchored in the specificity of landscape as an emerging and integrating discipline, while at the same time, they reclaim the great descriptors of historical landscape visions. Fiction is a trigger, generator, and sustainer of new realities, and in particular, it functions as an unfinished and personal narrative. So I think that we can all agree on the relevance of ecology as a subject, especially at a time where humans need to read, rebuild, and rewrite forms of fiction that can allow us to think and redefine how we interact with one another in this giant house or spaceship that we call Earth. So both Ana María and Martín, I would invite you to unfold your thoughts on the following question, which I'd like us, all of us as audience, to also embrace as an open-ended question. And Ana María, Martín, I would like you to introduce and perhaps continue the discussion on the importance of ecology in Latin America. How does ecology relate to anthropology and archaeology, perhaps in a more specific sense? And why are these pairs important for landscape and urbanism discourse today? Why gaining knowledge on different notions of ecology can continue to inform a design process that can perform change at local, territorial, and planetary scale?
Thank you, Mercedes. Ana María, would you like to go first? I think we don't hear you.
Martín.
Huh?
I'm here, but
Yeah, good.
You should start and then I'll follow.
Okay, so, all right. So I'll share my screen. Let me know if, oh, well, here. Share, okay. Is that okay? Do you see my presentation?
Yes.
Good, okay. So first, of course, I would like to thank Mercedes, Florencia, Magdalena, and everyone involved in the project for the fantastic work and also for the invitation. I prepared a kind of a small presentation, and this is meant to be a brief and deliberately undistilled response to somehow the main thesis of the seminar and of the publication. And I named it Ecology as Anthropology. And I even have a subtitle for it, which is Towards an Ecology of Others. And here I'm borrowing from Philippe Descola, which is one of the anthropologists that I will make some reference in the presentation. So my first image, if it's this one, okay, so I am here, view, enter full screen. Okay. My first image is a photograph by Brazilian photographer Araquém Alcântara. He's a well-known natural photographer, probably in the tradition of Sebastião Salgado and other Brazilian photographers, in which you can see two children playing, or rather dwelling, on the buttress roots of a gigantic tree in the Amazon rainforest. And I think this image speaks of a very intimate relationship between the human being, or the human animal, probably in these circumstances, and nature. One that can hardly be interpreted or interrogated alongside most of our Western paradigms, not only the distinction between nature and culture. And I move to my second image, which is also a photograph by Alcântara, who's my kind of hero today, taken in the Rio Solimões in the Amazon basin. And the image shows a native embracing a serpent. This image, I think, points out to the fact that for certain Amerindian cosmogonies, the animal or creature is our co-being. It's part of a community of others, or perpetrators of difference, that are yet inextricably linked to our own being or existence. The scene immediately strikes as almost the reverse of our traditional Western understanding of serpents as dangerous and venomous creatures, famously represented by the Laocoon group, that famous Greek sculpture that was discovered in the Renaissance. Both images, therefore, suggest a form of communal entanglement with, or continuity, and I think that this is an important word, the idea of continuity, between the human animal, zoology, and botany. Not only there's ecological continuity, which is well known between the two kingdoms, the natural and the animal kingdom, but also rhetorical and metaphorical continuity. Consider, for instance, the Brazilians have this apuzeiro tree, which is often referred to as a vegetal octopus. And I use this kind of metaphor or rhetorical comparison between the two kingdoms as a way of, I'm trying to track of my time, of the two kingdoms. So this anthropological reason, or I would like to call it like something like a law of continuity, is synthesized by Brazilian anthropologist Eduardo Viveiros de Castro in his book, Cannibal Metaphysics, I think very beautifully and very clearly, and I quote, "In the beginning, a particular type of Amerindian myth goes, there were only human beings, and human and animals were not yet distinct." End quote. In this book, Cannibal Metaphysics, Viveiros de Castro argues that the modern ontology and his building upon the ontological argument developed by Philippe Descola and then Viveiros de Castro and Eduardo Kohn and other anthropologists, The modern ontology is paradoxically the less equipped to incorporate difference. In short, in the modern ontology, there is no much room for magic, the irrational or the excessive. And I think that this expression, the notion of an ecology of others, with which I subtitled my presentation, speaks precisely of the possibility of ecological thinking outside our modern ontology and its accompanying ecological paradigms. This is rather a form of ecological thinking that's not derivative but constitutive, and therefore problematically invisible sometimes, I think, or hidden or latent. So this idea of ecology as anthropology speaks fundamentally about horizontalizing and articulating difference in a system in which there's no hierarchies between, say, a modern ontology or a native Amerindian or other ontologies. So just to conclude, I think that contemporary practices in the Americas have often resorted to the sort of picturesque and sometimes scientific tradition a la Humboldt, Condamine, and the Geodesic mission, the French mission, the Dutch landscape paintings, which is, of course, a kind of transatlantic connective tissue to the idea of landscape that we generated in Latin America, and certainly a powerful and enthralling imagery. But we spent probably too little time with this topical counterpart, that of anthropological issues and its emergence in the anthropological science in the form of a reverse anthropology. I think this is best expressed in the so-called turn to ontology, led by French anthropologist Philippe Descola, who I already mentioned, the Brazilian Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, or the Ecuadorian Ernesto Korn. I think that this type of reverse anthropology is a promising milieu where to find material for a new critical vocabulary that is both topical and universal, and could probably bring some sort of new agenda to this work of landscape practices in Latin America. So this was just a very brief presentation that I wanted to put forward, and I think that I hope Ana Maria will have the opportunity to talk about that and have a conversation rather than a monologue or boring long presentation.
Thanks, Martin. That was great. Yeah. Let's try to continue the conversation also with Ana Maria's point. Ana Maria, I think you can unmute your.
Should I?
Okay, I'm going to share my screen right now.
Okay.
Let me see, share. There we go, and present. I mean, this brief presentation resulted from the conversations that we have been having over the phone, which have been extremely stimulating to me. And initially from the conversations that engaged us, coming through NESS and Charles Waldheim's project. And what I've been doing in order to grapple with the immense complexity that the urbanization of Amazonia poses to South American and Latin American, and really architects and urbanists, landscape architects, urban planners all over the world, has forced me to undertake a process that I call submergence. And I'm taking this word from a Mapuche, a philosopher, because I do feel that right now we are in Latin America undergoing this submergence into the archaeological layers of our palimpsest in search for answers that are not coming from a world of contemporary urbanisms that in Amazonia mainly derive from neo-extractivism and a pretty brutal appropriation of our territories by immense capitals and national state-driven forces that are very difficult to resist, but that are being resisted actually throughout the continent. I also see in cities a process of outcropping of the past. So just as much as we are submerging ourselves, I feel that the layers, the deep layers of our history The pre-colonial ones are coming up into the surface. I saw these in Lima with, for example, the Huacas that are coming out into the city to populate the city. Some people say there are hundreds of them. Pachacamac is the main one, but Jean-Pierre Cruz has done a superb job at mapping and discussing these. But now, you know, you go to Lima and it's not the same Lima that I visited for the first time in the 90s. The same is happening in Quito. We had the outcropping as we were building the metro station of our pre-Hispanic past. It's happening in Norte Chico, which counts with some of the most ancient cities in the world. Norte Chico is a pretty unbelievable place. And it's happening in Tenochtitlan, in Mexico City. I just feel that these layers are outcropping in our cities, and also in the hinterlands, we're discovering that there are submerged cities, which is the case in the Amazon. And I won't get into the details of this. Amazonian archaeology has advanced immensely in the last 2 and 3 decades. In the 60s, there was I'm sorry, guys, I'm in a conference right now, so let's be silent, okay? I was saying that in the 60s, Betty Meggers and Clifford Evans produced this environmental determinism hypothesis for Amazonia, which said that basically, we know that through the Neolithic and then the urban revolution proposed by Charles, that there has to be agriculture, intensive agriculture, in order for a city to exist. So intensive agriculture is the prerequisite, the sine qua non of the city. That was the linear way of thinking that has been completely disarticulated now and questioned and debated, but that was the way that we thought back in the 60s. And that doomed the Amazon into becoming these like an urban place, because cities were simply impossible in an area where the soils are acid and where they're not capable of supporting intensive agriculture. But these theories started to be demounted in the 80s. The emergence of LiDAR has transformed archaeology deeply. And what we're learning about our continent and our region is incredible. Many evidence is piling up that basically is making it clear that Amazonia was highly urbanized. Hackenberger, for example, is arguing that in the Xingu in Brazil, there were cities that had populations of even like 350,000 individuals. So we're not talking about minor phenomena here. We're talking about large settlements that could compete with the Maya settlements in the forest of Central America. But what are the, what's the evidence behind this? One is terra preta, which is what you can see here on the right, which is a very dark, fertile soil that is anthropogenic in origin. On the left, you see some settlement patterns that we're going to go back to later. But here, for example, Eduardo Neves, a Brazilian archaeologist who has been revolutionary he was at Harvard, I think, for a while. He's been collecting all the information, all the mapping of terra preta, and demonstrating that it's quite extensive, not just along the fluvial corridors, but also in the interfluvial areas. And then Carolina Levis, a Brazilian ecologist that works in INPE in Manaus, has been collecting all the information that through satellite is being mapped using biogeographic techniques, using it's called the spectral footprint of domesticated and semi-domesticated useful plants that even today, and that's where anthropology and ethnography are important, that communities throughout Amazonia use today, and they've been mapping them, and they realize that the distribution of these species is neither environmental nor evolutionary, it is cultural. So they're realizing that the Amazon is to a large extent a cultivo, it's to a large extent a polyculture and highly anthropogenic. And of course, there's the issue of ontology. When the Europeans arrive in Amazonia, they see a chaotic mess, and it's very interesting to read the chronicles written by the Spanish monks. They see this chaotic mess. It's a crazy forest. It's a place, it's insane. But indigenous communes, and that word indigenous is complex, so I have to apologize for using it, don't see a chaotic forest. They see a polyculture that reproduces the ecology of the forest with several layers of plants competing for light, as we know. and that are very productive. You have everything from manioc in the ground, to these palm trees that provide with all sorts of fruits, nuts, construction materials, medicinal plants, etc., etc., etc. This group mapped only 50 of those plants that are highly used in Amazonia. There are more. And I've been looking at the settlement patterns of the Quichua along the Napo, and it's very interesting because the way they locate themselves in space is always in this urbanism and that's, I think, another thing that we need to clarify, that the Western ontology, as Charles was saying, has always been based on the idea of the compact city surrounded by rural areas and maybe a forest beyond. That has nothing to do with the way that pre-Hispanic cultures conceptualized their cities. They were always territorial. They were always an intertwining of forest, agriculture, settlement, and infrastructure. It is indivisible, and you will see this as you study pre-Hispanic cities one after the other, that in the ancient American ontology, the ontologies of the West completely collapsed. They are completely useless when we want to describe the cities of the Americas. They have always been urban ecologies. We lost this knowledge because we've been westernized, but now that it's, as I said, it's outcropping, I feel that we're retrieving and it's providing answers to those of us who are interested in breaking precisely through these borders, through these categories and these taxonomies that don't seem to work in the tropics at all. And you can see here the typical Quichua chacras, where you have a little clearing in the forest surrounded by the agricultural, the polyculture. It's never just a monoculture or a monocrop, surrounded by a highly cultivated forest, and then surrounded by the managed forest. So you see on the one hand, this vertical pattern that reproduces the logic of the forest, and on the other hand, this radial pattern, which is also linear along the river, radial in the micro scale of chakra to forest, and then how you resource from each one of these layers. But think about how, harmony is not the word, but how just embedded in the logic of the forest, this way of settling the jungle is. In contrast to the way we settle it, this is a government project called Ciudad Millennium, ironically based on the notion of an eco-village, which sort of reproduces a suburban North American pattern in the middle of the jungle. And it's sort of insane to me that we should import even green notions of eco-villages to an area that has some of the greatest lessons to be provided to us in terms of urban ecology. And of course, this is not just about morphology, it's about governance. A participatory democracy among indigenous populations is the most participatory democracy I've experienced in my life. It is truly amazing to see the assemblies, asambleas, they're called in Spanish, and of course that's a Spanish term, but these are indigenous practices that are ancient and that were coded by the law of Indies, by the Spaniards, because the Roman code could not absorb the Americas. So they had to create a new code in order to absorb the communal aspects of the Americas that the indigenous populations insisted in the 16th century that they wanted to preserve their lands as communal lands. They didn't want them to be privatized. They thought private property was a fiction, that the earth couldn't be appropriated. They didn't want them to be public either. They insisted on the communal. We know that Jefferson, for example, inspired himself immensely in the Iroquois and their democratic participation and confederation patterns when the US was being born as a democratic nation. So democracy is deeply embedded in the political system of the indigenous America, and that's the kind of urbanism that it generates. It's a decentralized urbanism, but it's networked. It's extremely interesting. What could be more of an urban ecology than Tenochtitlan in the 16th century? This city was completely destroyed. But we need to go back and revisit it. This is one of the layers that needs to emerge the outcrops are there in Mexico City, but we need to submerge ourselves to understand better the importance of cities like these ones, which are literally thought from an ecological point of view. Otherwise, they wouldn't be the way they are. And the same in the Beni, Bolivia, where Clark Erickson, an archaeologist that works at the University of Pennsylvania, actually the reason why I went to Penn was the work of this archaeologist that I wanted to be in touch with, because as a designer, I'm very interested in the kind of pattern that was produced in the Beni, for example, by the Amazonians there in order to harvest this amazing landscape without destroying it. And again, you see this decentralized system that's interconnected. These señoríos, these cacicazgos, these chiefdoms that are trading with each other, that are intermixing with each other. They have kinship relationships, and they have roads, they have canals, and they have chinampa systems. And it's just unbelievable. So when you see this city, it's a territorial city. It cannot be described in European terms. It is a network, and everything is intertwined in this logic. The forest is part of the city, the rural areas are part of the city, the settlement, areas are part of the city, and the infrastructure. It's all interconnected. It's all thought about in tandem, and it's a much more democratic system where the resources are being distributed in a much fairer way, because all the cacicazgos have access to the resources in this type of city. And then you have obviously, what has decanted from them. And we're trying to grapple with this fascinating past in Latin America. And for me, this archaeology has provided answers that I was not able to find in the contemporary literature. I think I know better how I would plan a city in Amazonia. And it is thanks to my engagement, not just with ancient pre-Hispanic cultures through archaeology, which is a field that I totally recommend all architects to engage right now, but also through anthropology and ethnography, because I have learned a lot just by visiting the Amazon and staying with the communes and seeing how they interact with the forest, how they live with the forest, and how they think. The word nature doesn't exist in most Amazonian languages. There are more than 300 languages just in Amazonia, and the word nature is absolutely absurd to them. When you ask them, can you translate nature for me? They just nod their head like trying to find an answer. And they're like, oh, there's no word, there's no such word in my language. And then they try to find, whatever's closest. There's a word for forest, there's a word for river, there's a word for, tree, but for nature as such, no, we don't have that concept. So, it's good to have that Amazonian challenge in the contemporary world, particularly to those of us who strongly believe in urban ecology as the future for all cities in the planet. Sorry, I think I spoke too much as always, so I'm going to close my microphone now.
Thank you. Thanks, Ana Maria and Martin. I think these two visions are really complementary to the publication, and are also a very clear position on how to continue to think throughout these topics, since as we had discussed perhaps previously, like these projects sometimes are telling stories, that were crafted and like forms of fiction that were thought through I don't know, like some 10 years ago or things like that. And I think that we need to sort of have an update and a fresh look at the term of ecology and what it means throughout different territories and cultures. I think that, I don't know, I might have like a micro question deriving from this, and Martin or Ana Maria, any of you can continue. What would be what would be like the interesting formats to sort of continue to surface like these ecological urbanisms that you refer to, that were always there somehow? What are the possible formats to somehow surface that? Does it need to continue to be through design? It's an open question, yeah.
In terms of design, I have a minor suggestion. One thing that I've started doing, for example, rethinking my own city, Quito, through the perspective of Amazonia, is that I realized in Amazonia that areas that are ecologically healthy, so to speak, generally overlap indigenous So I thought, what about Quito? And Quito has 72 Quitucara communes. And it's interesting, but they also overlap with incredibly green oases within the city that are distributed in this territorial fashion all over the city. So I thought, why not map those indigenous communes which are related with very interesting ecological areas and link them through green corridors and go back to that layer that I'm finding below the city that we have even forgotten about. And by bringing it to the surface, maybe structure a new urban ecology by linking these communes to the hydrological system, to the green corridors, and I'm building an urban ecology from the bottom up, from the historical, so to speak, bottom up. That's something that I find myself doing right now, and it's a very interesting exercise.
Yes, I think that when I was talking about kind of the turn to ontology in anthropology, it was basically speaking about that idea of an ecology that's constitutive and not derivative in the sense that it doesn't emerge from a kind of addition of a pre-existing paradigm, which is our very typically Western way of thinking everything, basically, which is very relative to our own position on the earth and to our own position in respect to the others, whether those others are trees, people, indigenous people, Amerindians, or animals or creatures. But I think that one way of thinking this question is to try to think in this kind of reverse way in which we are not placed as the modern ecological agent, but rather as part of an ecology, which is, as you were saying about nature, it's probably not even possible to name it or to call it ecology. In the same way that some people don't have the term nature because it's so natural, so intimate, and so intrinsically part of their own systems and cosmogonies that there's no way of naming something that has no symbolic distance with your own self or with your own being, ultimately. And I think this is something that happens when we think that animals and creatures and trees, for instance, in Amazonian cosmogonies could have agency and animistic properties. So we can, in fact, dialogue with them, of course, not with a linguistic rhetoric, but with other forms of rhetoric that are not necessarily linguistic. But there are forms of communication, non-linguistic communication with all those beings, trees, creatures, animals, the others, quote unquote, which are not others in this way of, or in this reverse ecology somehow. And I think that's a way of thinking the question also of multinaturalism as opposed to multiculturalism, and relativism as opposed of a kind of hierarchical structure of paradigm, whether it's ecological or anthropological. I don't know if that's more or less helped to.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting, Martin, also this addition and with this last idea on the difficulty of finding that a term, a translation of what we understand as nature is particularly relevant, right? Because nature is also kind of like trying to find a term, trying to name things is also a way of trying to get to know them, but at the same time trying to stabilize that we cannot make stable, I think, in a way.
And also by naming, we are instantly placing ourselves somehow outside of what we name, because there's a kind of implied distance when we name something. That's all that kind of Lacanian rhetoric of the name of the father and the name of the other, and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, you can continue and like.
I think in that sense, the question of the distance or the critical distance is another important or interesting thing to address. Because sometimes critical distance implies also detachment and a form of intellectual engagement that has nothing to do with other registers of life, being affect, being touch, animism, or things that are beyond the Western way of understanding reason and the rational. And with that, all the idea of that kind of obsessive taxonomizing of the world, of constantly organizing things in a particular place, instead of thinking phenomena or concepts in a much more dynamic and circuitous and unstable way. And I think that's part of what you were saying about destabilizing some the structures.
Sorry to interrupt. It's
absolutely.
just that we have like this very organic way of interacting with the audience, where we keep receiving like these comments from the chat. So like Magda was sharing with us, and perhaps we can use this to continue our discussion. Like, for example, Valente Sousa says Ana María and Martín are on point by empathy and with biosphere, of which we are strictly part of it. Nature is not the other, we are part of it. The new paradigm, because of our overlapping with the viral world, 6x10, 16 size, is to see the other not as the enemy, but we must give the other breathing space. Then we are also receiving something that looks more like a question for Ana María. It says that they're wondering how could designers from countries out of Latin America engage more in Amazon forest area in the future? Is that possible? Is there somehow like what's happening? Are they like lacking background of the local situation that perhaps that's what is making it not easy for everyone to sort of stay and live there and have a deep experience as you describe in your presentation? We're receiving this comment that we can use it as a sort of question. What would be the ways to bring others to somehow participate in the understanding of those forms of urbanization you were describing, Ana María?
That's a great question. And before I get into that, regarding the last thing that Martín said, it brought me to mind that another dualism that crumbles in Amazonia is the dualism between body and environment. If the body is sick, the environment is sick. There's no boundary between the body and the bodies of animals and the bodies of trees and the body and the spirits. It's a very spiritual world. So that's another thing that's very difficult for us Western minds to truly understand. Like, I don't pretend to do so. I try, but I feel extremely limited when I try to access ontologies. And Martín mentioned a book that I was looking at it as he was talking behind me, by Eduardo Con, who's an Ecuadorian anthropologist that wrote this book titled How Forests Think, because the forest is a thinking being. It's an agency. Maturana, the Chilean scientist, has huge indigenous influence in his thought as well. And in this idea of how forests think, and then he calls it anthropology beyond the human, precisely because the line between animal, human, body, environment is completely diluted and porous. And that's another thing that's very difficult for us to understand. And unless we understand that, we cannot understand the notion of cannibalism without judging it, misjudging it, I would say. But regarding what we can do for Amazonian urbanisms, to set up a lab right now, like I don't know how to call it. I don't know whether lab is the right word. Maybe it's an urban Amazonia collective, so that we can click into this notion of the communal collaboration that is very akin to Amazonians. But I feel that we need from the universities to create mechanisms to provide these kind of dialogues, not to impose, not to go and tell Amazonians what to do, but just to create participatory, collaborative collectives, precisely that grapple with the very complex hybrid situation of a modernizing Amazonia, which is mainly informal, 80% fabulization of the jungle, and mainly peri-urban, as they call it, or urban, talking about the lack of taxonomies to describe it. And we could create links between, collectives in universities and municipalities in Amazonia, large cities like Iquitos or Manaus, but also tiny oil boom towns like Lago Agrio and Coca. They'll be happy to collaborate. There's an absence of the state there, and there's an absence of technical teams. So I feel that the university has a very important role to play there. So, the South America project is sort of in the past for me. I'm thinking ahead in terms of like creating this network of architects, urbanists, landscape architects, planners that are willing to collaborate through their studios with municipalities in the region. So maybe, we can talk about that a little bit more with those who may be interested in being part of this project.
Mercedes,
Yes.
Could I have one word here?
Yeah.
Thank you for the introduction to the panel, Mercedes, and thank you, Martín and María, for your interventions. I think they're both really beautiful meditations. And the thing I wanted to just reinforce was the ultimate inadequacy of our language, our conceptual frameworks. I think in the context of the Amazon, you encounter an object of study that's so deep and so dense that it really challenges, the inadequacy of these concepts that we bring. So whether it's from the anthropological point of view or this very intriguing kind of return to the archaeological for evidence, I think a part of this, reinforces my sense, that landscape in the Western tradition, the European tradition, it only emerged when any real, kind of organic or authentic relationship to, a set of conditions was severed through urbanization and commerce and capital. And so, of course, we have this dilemma where, we're in the academy always looking to sharpen our intellectual tools. And you've both in different ways touched on the need to go back to these ontological frameworks and maybe look again at anthropology and ethnography and archaeology, but to do so in a more, let's say, could I use the term situated? I mean, I appreciate your caution about the indigenous and indigeneity. And of course, we need to be, concerned about the coming in for extraction or the bringing in of knowledge. I think both of you have really put on the table a very powerful call for us to fundamentally rethink in a very place-centric way the most fundamental terms, conceptual and ontological terms that we can bring to bear on these studies. So in that regard, I think the questions are appropriate in terms of how can we even begin to think about working in these places and who's authorized to help us think in that way.
Thanks, Charles. Yeah, I think that with these ideas, we can perhaps start to conclude. We don't have more than 1 minute, and we need to be generous also with the rest of the panels. But we have all kinds of comments coming up also from the webinar chat. I think that this opportunity to also reflect on this like overlap of the unpredictable in terms of how we continue to make urbanism is quite interesting, as someone was commenting on, like this new paradigm of the viral world that is kind of taking over our decisions and our positions towards what we can anticipate and what we cannot anticipate. So let's see, I think that we should be concluding. I don't know if both Martín and María have like a last word so that we can transition to the next panel.
Ana María, you go first.
I think I'm ready for the next panel. I feel I've
Yeah,
spoken
me too.
too much.
Yeah.
Yeah, it feels like we got to a critical point, and it's good to keep it there. So thank you both, Martina and Maria, and Charles, all super interesting visions, and we thank also the audience for participating actively. Thank you.
Thank you, Mercedes.
Thank you all. Now we will show a short video with voices from the projects featured in the publication, and then we will continue with the second panel with Jeannette, Eliza Silva, and Alfredo Ramirez.
Es un hecho la escasez de proyectos urbanos en las ciudades latinoamericanas. Sin embargo, en los proyectos públicos y de paisaje que nos ha tocado participar, hemos visto un uso y un éxito casi inesperado. Esto pone en manifiesto la escasez de espacios públicos de calidad en la ciudad. Por lo mismo, creemos necesario poder difundir este tipo de proyectos para dar cuenta de que se pueden hacer cosas mejores y distintas en nuestro contexto y en nuestras ciudades.
Sí, por otra parte, el dar visibilidad a oficinas como la nuestra contribuye a ampliar la discusión disciplinar al ámbito de lo público y de esa manera conocer lo que están haciendo nuestros colegas en nuestro entorno, que generalmente es de muy buen nivel, y de esa manera subir o incrementar la calidad de los proyectos que intervienen en el espacio público.
Perhaps the idea of urban projects should be extended to projects working with the urban dimension, which take us to a much more unstable but interesting arena because it questions the idea of scale. We can talk about large or medium-scale projects like a public space or an urban renovation, but at the same time it opens the door to less usual manifestations such as pavilions, dealing with the idea of permanent or temporal. Architecture can also be unstable, ephemeral, or performative, and by so it can generate new changes in the urban dimension. Small practices like mine tend to find spaces within the cracks of the system and the voids left apart by the larger practices. Working in large urban projects is very difficult for a studio like mine because you have to deal with a bureaucratic system that tends to leave apart experimentation and small practices. But in this scenario, dealing with other projects like ephemeral pavilions can be an effective strategy to raise more speculative questions among the usual responses that can shift new discussions within our cultural context.
Latinoamérica y sus ciudades siempre crecientes, con cambios fuertes de densidad, desigualdad extrema, moderna y a la vez precaria, son la condición base que se repite. Bajo esto aparecen dos escalas de intervención que pienso atacan esta desigualdad. Una primera a largo plazo, incorporando la planificación del paisaje en las políticas de desarrollo transversal de la ciudad, y una segunda, pensando en corto plazo, y que es donde creo podemos aportar ahora como práctica, a través de intervenciones de escala media o menor, con proyectos de arquitectura y paisaje puntuales desplegados por la ciudad que permitan potenciar y renovar sectores deteriorados o socialmente marginados. Creo que la riqueza del paisaje natural latinoamericano se debe trasladar a nuestras ciudades para transformarlas, cargando dichos espacios de identidad e interacción, entregando experiencia a quien lo visite, lo que es mucho más que solo dar verde, generando lugares con flexibilidad de uso y de verdadero sentido público. Este es el punto de partida para la construcción del paisaje como práctica emergente en América Latina.
Thank you all. We will now listen to Jeannette, Sordi, Eliza Silva, and Alfredo Ramirez. Jeannette Sordi is an architect and urban planner based in New York City. She currently teaches at New York Institute of Technology and is a consultant for the Inter-American Development Bank on the projects in Uruguay and Argentina. Until 2018, she was a professor at the Adolfo Ibáñez University in Chile, and together with Charles Waldheim, Luis Callejas, and Felipe Vera, she initiated the Landscape as Urbanism in the Americas project. Eliza Silva is principal and founder of Enlace Arquitectura and Enlace Foundation, established in Caracas, Venezuela. She has a Master of Architecture degree from Harvard CSD and is a visiting professor at the Princeton University and the Daniels Faculty of Architecture at the University of Toronto. Alfredo Ramirez is an architect, director of Ground Lab, and co-director of the Landscape Urbanism postgraduate program at the Architectural Association in London. Ramirez leads research projects that investigate the agency of design within Earth systems and the production of territorial projects to face climate change and planetary urbanization.
Okay. Thank you, Magdalena, for the introduction, and dear Alfredo, dear Elisa, thank you so much for accepting our invitation to participate, and thank you everybody for being here. So as Magdalena briefly mentioned, Eliza Silva is the principal and founder of Enlace Arquitectura and Enlace Foundation, both established in Caracas, Venezuela. The two entities work in tandem to advance the integration of cities, including informal settlements, through participatory design processes and cultural programs. Alfredo Ramirez is the co-director of Ground Lab and of the Architectural Association Landscape Urbanism Master's Program, and has led the development of large-scale projects at the junction of architecture, landscape, and urbanism in the UK, Spain, Russia, China, Mexico, Argentina, and Chile. It's really an honor to have them here to join the discussion, and I'm looking forward to it. So among the issues that we presented in this NESS doc on landscape as urbanism in the Americas is somehow the idea that landscape can be a medium to mitigate differences and smooth borders in the urban environment, rethink the territory, and also include a broader audience through public works. I think one of the main contributions of the landscape urbanism discourse, and Charles Waldheim highlighted this today again, the need for a new language, is that it really provided a framework to describe urban and infrastructural projects that were experimenting with hybrid typologies, breaking the traditional contrapositions between city and nature, interior and exterior, public and private, and therefore offering new inputs to urban design and also new meanings and functions for the urban space. We found that like these borders and contrapositions can be very evident in Latin American cities. Ana María was telling us how this was not the case for native populations, but nevertheless, over the centuries, the uninhibited process of exploitation of territory and resources really shaped the territory and is often also perpetuated in the urban space, resulting in very evident inequality and segregation. And in a way, like this uneven access to urban space and resources might just worsen in the next years. We have seen now the impact of the pandemic. We know global warming, extreme climate events will just be harder and more frequent and are leading to massive population displacement, loss of opportunity, loss of biodiversity. I'm really happy to have here Eliza Silva and Alfredo Ramirez, as they have really amazing work on public space in Latin American cities. And in particular, I just share a couple of images for those who haven't seen the publication yet. But for example, Alfredo's project for the Paseo Nueva Providencia in Chile is a 8 kilometers axis that crosses through the city and through a hybrid and multifunctional infrastructure connects the more marginal and poorest areas of the city through the areas that are richest in services. Eliza Silva's work, and here in the NESS doc, we featured the Plaza Jorge Somaca, in Caracas. Instead works with public punctual interventions on public space, developed with communities. And I think like really both approaches can tell us a lot about how to intervene on public space. And I was wondering if we could expand a bit more on this, on how your approach to designing public space in Latin American cities.
Certainly, Janet. Who would you like to start first, Alfredo? Or
you can start, Elisa.
Hi, Alfredo.
I don't know if you want to share images or I should just leave your projects as a background.
Well, I included a few images just to give context, so I can jump in, and they're just images. That's all they are, really. Yeah, I thought that was a fascinating and important question, you know, how to operate within this context and what that imposes on the designer. And I thought I'd share two projects that have very different kind of operative approaches this is Sabana Grande, which was the result of a one competition in 2008, and then finally the construction was complete in 2011. So this comes from the government. It's very much imposed, and I think the implications that have on the project are very substantial. It's a 1 million square foot, so 1,000 square meters of pavement project essentially, and neither the residents, the commercial spaces, the merchants, nobody was consulted on the project. And even if they had been consulted, it would have come to no avail. Government wasn't really going to take their concerns into consideration, and their response would have been very negative, since trust in government is very weak, not just now, but even historically. And I admit that even I was very skeptical that this competition would actually come to fruition, which is rare in Latin America. So the strategy from my part ends up being one that tries to bring in what was absent, sort of, well, at least an acknowledgement of the pre-existence of the site, which used this very same concrete paver in a way to kind of, foresee if only a piece was built, it would still seamlessly go along with what was there before. And the other is just one single level across the entire surface, which is in a way to create a platform upon which all these activities and distinctions can occur. And a very opposite one, which is the other kind of public space projects that we do, which are in barrios or informal settlements. And these are landscapes that have been self-built, everything, the homes, the stairs, the walkways, and even the gardens. So this means that there's an important work to do in terms of reflecting on what is already there, on what it means, because it's very personal. So mapping what is there, both physically and in people's memories, what they associate with the place, it has to be taken into account. And then also the project's completely determined by a very, very modest budget. I mean, none of these projects exceed $10,000. So these are always in dialogue with the community, and at the same time distilled to its smallest expression. What I think is important, though, is that barrios in Venezuela are the home to half of the city's population. This is a bit of the meetings and so forth that went into the Jorge Somaca project that's featured in the book. So even though half of the population lives there, these are very marginalized territories in the imaginary of the non-barrio dwellers, the other half, and also the government, who frankly doesn't treat these people except to manipulate for public benefit, or frankly today in subordination. So the charge is that these places become part of the public domain, not just of the community in the barrio, but of the entire city. These are platforms that place them on the map in a way, potentially for a lot of people. And then the next question becomes, well, how do you actually produce that mobility across the entire city? So I think I'll leave it at that. That was sort of what I wanted to share with regard to this first question.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you, Jeannette. I don't have images to share. We can just, I can answer my experience in regards working in a public project, such as the one of Providencia Alameda, which is
I can put back the image maybe, if you like.
Yeah, if you want, it's fine. Obviously, for the audience, they can just get the NESS Talk and see the full project and images that we do. But basically, what I wanted to share regarding the first question is my experience, no? And probably also not only my experience in this project, but what has been the sort of outcome within our practice, no? Working in this type of projects. So originally, well, this project was a public competition, and this isn't my project. Let's say it's a project of a large team, that we put together. That includes Arturo Lyon, Alejandra Bosch, Danilo Martic, Sergio Chiqueto, and engineers from IDOM. And this was a kind of a rare opportunity we had to participate in one of the few public competitions that of this scale. No, I mean there are many public competitions, but the scale of the project is quite daunting. No, it's 12 kilometers avenue that crosses 4 comunas in Santiago de Chile, and that was an incredible opportunity, to sort of create a project that may unify an important space in Santiago de Chile, which is basically a space that everything happens, from protests, to neoliberal policies that are happening in some cases very recently, or celebrations, of the national team winning the America Cup. So it was a tremendous challenge that we took over. And we tried to basically base it in a number of different principles. One of them was obviously to understand the context and the history of the avenue, even trying to recover parts of the nature, in quotation marks, that exist in the area, and because this avenue is basically a branch of the Mapocho River. So that was we tried to almost implement all these ideas we had on landscapes, that can organize, that can create models for urban spaces into a project, and we were successful in winning the competition. Now, the project has been developed. We finished the project, and we'll see whether this is something that may be or not implemented. But the thing is, one of the aspects which I wanted to share also with the audience, and as part of the reflection of this, is or one of the conclusions that we arrived at the end is that there is so much we can do, let's say, in regards to the profession as it stands right now in terms of design, because there are a number of issues that are also very relevant, but they are not at the moment within reach, let's say, of the profession. And one of them is the policies, through which these are implemented, many of which basically constrains many of the opportunities that we have to develop the project. For example, I think Charles mentioned at the beginning of the intro that there were a number of different policies and kind of almost economic policies that allows this shift of mentality or certain type of project like these ones to happen in various cities across Latin America. But at the same time, those very same policies restricts some of the ideas that are more relevant right now. For example, I can mention the efficiency, that in some cases relates a lot with certain neoliberal policies that, for example, in this case, always try to allow cars, or that kind of private transport to be moving very fast, and that's the reason why the shape of the avenue is straight and allows a certain speed, But when you try to pedestrianize, for example, levels, parts of the avenue, etc., those policies are difficult to tackle, So we try to understand in that regard, what our profession can actually do in terms of perhaps even visualizing those policies that at the moment might allow this type of project, but at the same time constrains the full potentiality of them, And it's something that we are trying now to develop, in the office, to think about not only this type of a specific intervention, but perhaps how one can understand the policies that allows this to happen, and and specialize this type of projects.
Yeah, this is absolutely relevant. If I'm not wrong, there is an issue also in merging so many different departments and disciplines to really understand this project and bring it forward.
Yes. No, it's obviously a kind of complex kind of relationship, that one needs to entail, But But again, it's something that perhaps as a profession, one needs to also kind of reflect, no? What is the relation between this type of projects and the ways in which we can contribute, no, to other ways to think the city.
Yeah, actually, this leads me to another question that I think is really relevant to this discussion and is your work. And in a way, like when we, as architects or urban designers, we look at landscape architecture, there has always been a very strong interest in the tools or set of practices that landscape can provide, from incorporating ecological dynamics and biological elements in the project, or using mapping as a tool to unveil ground conditions, work with topography, thinking of processes over time, systems. Is there any tool, framework, or point of view that is particularly relevant to the work you're doing and also for the present and future of Latin American cities?
We can invert the order if you want, Alfredo, this time. You can go first.
Okay. Yes, I mean, for me, let's say in my practice or my experience, no, I've been trying to practice this thing called landscape urbanism. One of the things that I learned, obviously, from the beginning is sort of the interconnectedness, no? That the urbanization has at the scale of the planet, no? And this is something that, for me, it's very crucial, and it's something that we, as practitioners or as landscape architects or landscape urbanists, if we wish, we need to understand, no? And so, on the one hand, is obviously this the understanding of this interconnectedness, no? And the possibility for us to perhaps be able to visualize that, no? Because one thing that for me is crucial is something that comes or that can be perhaps better explained by a phrase that I read from a naturalist writer, English writer, which is called Robert Macfarlane, and that says that all cities are additions to a landscape that requires subtraction from elsewhere. And this is something that for me has become very crucial, no? To try to first of all understand how things are working, no? Not only necessarily in a performative manner, which is crucial, obviously in an ecological manner, but also almost in a political and economic manner, no? Because if we understand, or if we try at least to understand how this interrelation works, no? Then we can try and have a better goal, let's say, or to rethink or to reimagine processes of urbanization, no? So that's something that for me is crucial, and it's something that we're trying to do right now in our practice, no? Like trying to visualize this subtraction, no? Or in some cases extraction, no? Or of materials that we use for buildings to produce the cities or the spaces in which we have it, the food that is required for those cities to be to go on, no? The water, etc., etc. No, I mean, obviously there are all the cities in the world, including Latin America, they have this interconnectedness, no? And this affects obviously those landscapes or those territories that typically are normally more invisible or seems to be disconnected, no? Like perhaps the examples our colleagues mentioned at the beginning, no? The Amazonas, or you know, communities that seems to be disconnected, no, from cities, but sometimes they are more intrinsically connected, because in some cases they've been dispossessed from the land, no? They used to manage in a completely different manner, as they were explaining. But these things is something that for me it's crucial to understand. I mean, Mexico City is a typical example, no, of how these interconnected work. Like it's a city that depends on water from other basins, no? And in order to really think about a completely different idea of Mexico City that can be, or that can be based on, hydrological systems or even natural systems that exist in that, we need to understand how it's actually working right now. So we can really embrace other ideas, other ways of thinking, or break apart from these things. No? So that's something that I think, for me, landscape has brought upon to my practice, and it's something that is crucial for Latin American cities at least.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, I think I'll maybe just focus on one aspect of tools or needs that go beyond sort of the most conventionally understood ones. Definitely mapping is crucial as a way to kind of highlight and recognize what are pre-existing values or phenomena, dynamics within communities. We are an office that works very much and focuses on trying to understand how we can help improve and at the same time mostly integrate the informal settlements, or the barrios as we call them in Caracas, to just the notion of the city, of a complete city. We've talked a lot about the complete city. And so it's really required for us to first expand ourselves into a very broad and multidisciplinary team with artists and journalists and musicians, dancers, to find so many different ways of connecting with people and to enable a process of just kind of uncovering all the value that's there. So that's, I think, been one of the most amazing discoveries for me in the last couple of years of art practice, where after sort of finding a kind of a barrier within our approach as designers and, focusing on the public spaces, for example, that are featured, one of which is featured in the book, being able to be designers in a relevant way for communities and understanding them as pieces of a larger city. We started a project called Integration Process Caracas through our NGO. So that's something interesting too, is that 3 years ago, we branched off and also became an NGO, which allows us to plug into grant funds and gives us, this opportunity to construct programs as we see them. So I might just flip through images and describe them so you get a sense of what I'm trying to get at. So here is the group, and we all have this t-shirt called The Complete City with various definitions. And these are people that are from the community of La Palomera, some of the artists that we work with, some people in our team. And what I love is that there's no need to distinguish who's who. That's sort of a beautiful result of this. I think the fact that the program has lasted now for 1.5 years is also very important. These can't be like touch and go type of engagements, and this has actually been an organic process. This will continue to allow us to research, discover, and propose more things into the future. But it really starts off like on the street in the barrio, and these are musicians that you see playing very typical songs with verses that are called décimas, and the lyrics are talking about integration, and are talking about what the barrio contributes to the city. Sometimes we've had actors, like prominent TV actors, who have declared in the public plaza this kind of manifesto of what a complete city is about and all of its integration. It opened a series of kind of different avenues. One was to map all the gardens of the Palomera. Like, people might not have an idea that that is a value for the residents, and it's incredible how much they know and all their knowledge that we kind of mapped them. Even had a certain day where we invited everybody from Caracas to come and visit the gardens of La Palomera. And this has, continued to evolve. We were able to identify 260 species that grow in La Palomera and what they're used for, and if they have medicinal properties or not. So venturing into these kinds of things, the celebrations that happen in the community, like the Cross of May, we've rescued them and brought sort of a new meaning about what they mean is celebrating the city as well. You know, this is a celebration that comes from rural areas that historically had to do with May, which is when the rainy season comes. And then the barrios kept this as migrants that came from the rural areas to the city. And this is something that is pertinent to the rest of the city. It's a celebration of the city. We then have continued, and this was an abandoned structure. The community asked us to think about what we could do with them about it. And this will now become a center for art and culture that we're really excited to start working with the community on that, and have just secured funding for it. But this was like a first day to kind of preview the potential that it might have, bringing, you know, video artists in, and music and dancing, and all these people that know a great deal about traditional dance, traditional music, and it's sort of ubiquitous across demographic segments of the population, and barrio dwellers and non-barrio dwellers. And then at the end, we tried to synthesize that into an exhibition, which is in Caracas right now. And part of this will be at the biennial next summer, of the entire experience and what that meant methodologically. This is that dictionary of plants that I was talking about. So all of these are just different and various approaches to show that in effect, there's many ways and layers of how to value these communities that we can uncover. I think the key is to become very broad in our reach, and work interdisciplinary with a lot of other cultural advocates and professionals.
Thank you. It's really amazing to show now in a way how complementary these approaches are, and how we can go from really a large-scale database analysis to incorporating people and mapping out these elements really in real time. I think we have a few more minutes. If maybe somebody from the audience or the other panelists want to jump in.
Jeannette, hey, I can maybe continue the conversation just briefly. First of all, thank you, Alfredo. Thank you, Elisa, for your interventions. It's lovely to see this work and to see you both. I'm struck by your comments. Both of you have spoken about the ways in which projects are conceived, the ways in which they're made available to designers. And I think you've both touched on, I think very appropriately, the limitations, let's say, the kind of inadequacy. You know, in my experience in the region, it's the one part of the world where I'm introduced to a public official, their title, and how many more months or years they have in office. Mm-hmm. And so on the one hand, you know, I guess to frame it as a question, I wonder if you could help me think through. On the one hand, in the region, we have I think, a very strong tradition. It's uneven, of course, different cultures and different contexts, but a dominant tradition of the expectation that the city, the municipality, the government is meant to deliver the public realm. Mm-hmm. And I appreciate the challenges that you're both touching on, but compared to, you know, my part of the world these days, that seems to be an incredible aspiration, you know, that a mayor would be elected and would be expected to improve the public realm. But you've both touched on and highlighted in your own work the kind of limitations of waiting for projects in that regard, in terms of how they've been conceived, how they're funded, in which context of capital they're organized, and the like. And I know you've both been active in both NGOs and research groups and other mechanisms of project formation, let's say. Could you say something about that from your experience?
Alfredo, what would you prefer?
You?
Okay.
It's your turn.
That's a great question. I think I'll be a little bit anecdotal in my answer. I arrived in Caracas in 2007, very eager to sort of really dive into the notions of informal settlements. I hadn't yet really found something that I felt jived or made sense within my own kind of academic background and formation. It took a long time to kind of get to a comfortable place. Public space definitely emerged quickly, though, as a real opportunity on many levels and for many reasons. But Venezuela, and I can really only speak specifically about Venezuela, is an oil-rich country with a very well-funded government for a number of years. And the custom among the population was to understand that the government was responsible for everything and anything. Even your own kind of condominium problems were of the government to resolve. And what has happened over these past 2 decades with an extremely inefficient government and services collapsing right and left, and is that the civil society as a notion, as an entity which did not exist, has completely come to the fore, empowered themselves, and intervened in a number of areas which were previously relegated to the public realm or to the public entities. So activists looking for more space for bicycles, different types of projects within informal settlements, public space recovery or notions of public space, like who's the street for. All of these things are coming from civil society now, and a number of organizations, from the arts, from professions. I think mayors have in many ways taken a back seat in these recent years. They are also underfunded, and so in that sense have very little agency. But I have to say that I appreciate that this has happened. It's awakened an opportunity for civil society. It's given us a chance to propose and do things with community without the nuisance of political campaigning and political manipulations. And I feel once we have had this sort of appetite and seen how this can work, even in the future, when and if a political scene changes for the country, we'll have benefited from this moment and all the learning that came from it.
Yeah, no, I agree with Elisa, and I think, but from my perspective, there is also an opportunity in other aspects, no? Like for example, in the policy aspect, which is something that I'm very interested in right now, especially because acknowledging the fact that governments and authorities, they last in Latin America 3 or 6 years at most, no? I can see, for example, a number of policies, no, that are based on efficiency, no, that are based on principles of controlling nature. I mean, they are, and they have been last for a number of years right now, no, and believe it or not, they shape, no, the spaces that we are living, no, and many of the commissions, many of the competitions are actually frame under those policies with those principles, no? So one of the things that I've been reflecting and trying to find answers, no, I don't have one specifically, but it's like one of the skills that landscape practices, no, even architectural practices, is spatialize the consequences of these things, no, that it's barely done nowadays, no, and perhaps there might be a possibility to rethink or propose, I mean, not us, but together with other practices, and obviously the collaboration and transdisciplinarity is very important, to think about, future policies that, are based on principles of solidarity, of empathy with nature, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's, perhaps it's something that requires, it's a long-term process, no? It's not a ground process like what Elisa is mentioning, which is also very relevant, no? And something that we're trying to do right now is, working with NGOs and think tanks, no, that are typically economists, no, that influence or try to influence, ideas on how, for example, Green New Deal, no, here in the UK or in the US, no, that is, are trying to transition towards a different type of economies, or towards a different types of understanding, no, of relationship between society and nature. And for me, it's very crucial to involve, no, our skills, to visualize them, no, because if at some point these things are successful, and I hope they are, no, they will have an impact in the space that we create, no, and obviously there's a range of activities that we can do as a profession, but one of them is this collaboration that perhaps could create a number of ways in which we can structure in a different way, no, this relation, no, so. Without saying that when bottom up and top down, no, it's not, they are not mutually exclusive, no? They can actually, I mean, I have certain hopes about how you can actually work that out and use the skills that we have, no? And it's something that I hope many people will be interested in as well in doing.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, me as well.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and for what we have seen, like through the conferences in Medellin, Brasilia, etc., and this publication, like there is really a lot of like leading by example, like amazing projects that really made a difference in the cities and are published widely, and that in a way show how this can change for the best. Okay, I think we are really perfect with time, so we will stop it here. Thank you so much, Charles, for jumping in, and Alfredo and Elisa for being with us today. And I will leave it to Magda.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you all. Now we will continue with another video with voices from the projects featured in NESS Talks 2. And after that, we'll have our final panel with Florencia Rodriguez y Luis Callejas, and then we will celebrate the publication.
This is a great opportunity to redefine the idea of landscape across the continent and in each one of these cultures. Landscape is not only an exotic background made mythical by modern architecture or scientific narratives. Landscape as a possibility to stop understanding nature as a resource for economical extraction such as mining. Here in Colombia, landscape defines culture, and perhaps is the only common surface being socially inclusive and allowing a public spatial experience available for everyone, despite income, race, or origin. Landscape plays a political role, a tool for relating different agents and situations in space, usually apart from each other. It creates a common ground. Here we participate with two projects. Orquídea in association with Plan B and J. Paul Restrepo is a public wood and steel canopy of undefined borders, a space of the in-between. Pharma Park, it is inverse mining. Instead of taking out, it brings in native species with biochemical properties. Space is then organized, not giving value to trees and plants by appearance, but instead it proposes to organize a space by its chemical values and properties, creating a different aesthetic, giving form to space from another input, a biochemical landscape.
Soy Lucía Ardizone, formo parte de Bulla, una oficina de paisaje con visión regional y base en Buenos Aires. Desde el estudio repensamos las comunidades ambientales, naturales y sociales como nuevos modelos de vivir colaborativamente. A diferencia de nuestras ciudades latinoamericanas que se desarrollaron sobre un mosaico de paisajes omitidos, nuestras investigaciones y nuestras experiencias se basan en comprender el funcionamiento del ecosistema que habitamos, comprender y visibilizar su estructura, su funcionamiento, sus dinámicas y sus flujos, como los biológicos, hidrológicos, climatológicos, etc., que siguen estando activos a pesar de todo y que en definitiva son los que marcan los rasgos más característicos de nuestra cultura. Entendemos la ecología como una tecnología. Repensar el urbanismo desde esta óptica ecosistémica y social nos lleva a proyectar interfaces en donde nos permiten reconectar, repensar, interpelar y sobre todo potenciar el vínculo entre la naturaleza y el hombre.
Para nosotros los proyectos urbanos de paisaje en Latinoamérica son muy importantes porque son los lugares de intervención, de interacción democrática, son los lugares donde todos podemos estar, donde todos podemos, es donde la vida sucede, donde la vida acontece, donde pueden aparecer relaciones entre personas, donde aparece el trabajo, donde se vive pues como la vida en sí misma, sobre todo en ciudades como las nuestras, que tenemos un tema de inequidad, entonces un lugar, digamos, horizontal donde todos podemos estar. Dos, nos interesa hacer visibles este tipo de proyectos porque mantiene, digamos, la importancia de hacer obra pública y espacio público en nuestras ciudades, ¿no es cierto? Es como el espacio de mayor calidad, el espacio que es para todos, lo que construye ciudad, entonces creemos que es muy importante resaltar estas prácticas. 3, nuestro proyecto de jardinería sostenible no es un proyecto de grandes masas, de grandes superficies de metros cuadrados diseñados, por el contrario son pequeñas acciones, pequeños dispositivos, muy pequeños pero grandes detonantes urbanos en la medida en que hay mucha interacción con ellos, en la medida en que construyen un paisaje, en la medida en que dan información e intercambio de información y que construyen un paisaje entre personas, tecnología y naturaleza.
That was great, thank you. Finally, we will hear from Florencia Rodríguez and Luis Callejas. Florencia Rodríguez is co-founder and editorial director at NESS. She was trained as an architect in Buenos Aires and has devoted her career to writing and editing. She is a Leo Fellow Class 2014 at the Harvard CSD. In 2010, she also founded Plot, a publication she directed until 2017. She has taught in institutions such as Universidad Torcuato Di Tella, Universidad del Litoral, and the Boston Architectural College. Luis Callejas is a landscape architect, founder of LC LA office and full professor of landscape architecture at the Oslo School of Architecture and Design. The studio is based in Oslo and is led by him and Swedish architect Charlotte Hansson. Luis Callejas taught architecture and landscape architecture at Harvard CSD.
Well, hello. Hi.
Hello. Hi.
Hi, Luis. How are you? Well, first of all, I need to make some catharsis and say I really miss landscape and the city. We are here locked down, so it's great to share this moment with all of you. And while not caring about being a little bit repetitive, I want to start by some acknowledgements. And thank you, Charles, for sharing with us your valuable experience and research and the continuous enriching conversation. Thank you, Mercedes and Jeannette, for sharing your ideas and committing to the curatorial process as we did. It was a great experience and I really enjoyed it. Thank you, Marcela Ramos and the Rockefeller Center for the Latin American Studies. This publication wouldn't have been possible without your support, and it was really great to be able to keep on going all of this process and make it into a book finally. And finally, I want to say that NESS team has been outstanding, and we are all navigating through this difficult year in which we are all working from home, sheltering in space. But I know that that has been very far away from staying still. And this encounter that we are all sharing today is one of the consequences of that energetic moment that we are living right now. The practices here today are like very essential for our work every day, and they are the essence of our work, you know, as editors. And to put together different experiences, and in that act, being able to resignify them while reading them as a collective body of work is to open a possibility of new dialogues, of new exchanges, and the participation and generosity of all have been like incredible, and I'm very grateful. As an editor and critic working from Latin America, landscape has always been one of the mediums, borrowing from Charles, that I wanted or I intended to give visibility to. And I feel there's an urge in a way to expand that discussion about the cities or territories and many of the topics that have already come out today in the conversations. In that path, during the last, I could say more than 10 years, Luis has been kind of an ally in many conversations that we have had, privately in meetings, in conferences, or in different parts of the world as well. So it's amazing to finish this event with a dialogue with you, Luis. And I want to start this just like going backwards a little bit and remembering how the seminar that you did with Charles at the beginning of the Landscape as Urbanism in the Americas project started, inviting new practices from the territory and the continent. How did it happen? What did you discover there, and how did it keep it going?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, this was a seminar that was linked to this project. So I won't describe the project. I think Charles described it very well already. The seminar was, I guess, an opportunity to also share this research that was going on at Harvard at that time, also with the students in a quite direct way. Something that we realized very quickly is that yes, there was an interest from many faculty, of course, and the Rockefeller Center to do this investigation, but there was also an appetite from the students at the school to get to know more of these practices. And I think at that time, it's not like these Latin practices were underrepresented. I think some of them were already being invited to the school to lecture. Some were publishing in English already, but I think it's fair to say that a large percentage of the practices that even the ones that ended up included in the book were in a way underrepresented, but also just literally just completely unknown for many of the students that had curiosity on Latin America. So it was incredible because we started with this quite wide scope, perhaps even too wide. It was impossible to do this through a, let's say, historical lens, because we also wanted to include very young practices, but it was also impossible not to include their influences and obviously quite a few practices that are not alive anymore. So what we did is that we, this was, by the way, taught with Pedro Aparicio as well, that is listening. We started to choose these practices and ask the students to look at the work for what it is and intentionally not pay too much attention to the context where these projects or these practices are acting. So we did that in the second part of the seminar. So we basically invited many of these practices to lecture by Skype, not very different to what is happening now. And we had the chance to invite a few practices that we couldn't include in some of these trips that we did with Charles and the others. I think there were quite incredible conclusions that came from the student side. They were very much into the questions of form, especially because we started without actually looking at the context. And we quickly realized that this is one of the aspects that has been perhaps under-described recently. It often happens perhaps because of the complexity and of the context, and also the quite harsh reality of the sites where these projects are happening. So we, in a way, intentionally wanted to also give some space and some stage to the actual formal attitudes that these practices use, and their capacity to abstract and also to react as architects and landscape architects to these, of course, very loaded problems in very complicated sites, most of them, but also with quite refined and elegant aesthetic sensitivities and formal responses.
That's great. And going back to that idea, we were talking this week about form and social context, and how certain activities or projects that are sometimes not described with this social reading are impossible not to understand like that as Latin American, even though we don't need to mention that sometimes. It's like our cities and are so vibrant in a way, and we have so many political facts going on, and so many things like inequality and complexities that are part of our everyday life, that they are part of the projects. And in a way, all the Colombian projects that started like being part of very important part of the conversation, I would say 15 years ago or 10 years ago, in that lapse of time in which many architects like yourself and Felipe Mesa and Camilo Restrepo and this whole group started talking about landscape and being very intentional in your ways of representation. How do you think you were putting together these social aspects of Latin American cities or Colombian cities? Because let's talk about the particularities, because Latin America is a huge territory. And how were you putting this together, and this idea of ecology and anthropology that was in the first panel in a way like floating there, how was that incorporated?
Well, I will first finish the last idea. I think there was something really interesting with these practices that we started to map. And one is that, and as I communicated to the students, look at the sites where these projects are happening. Most of them are not flat. And that means that they need to reach a level of detail and formal resolution that, of course, is in tune and in synchronicity with all these issues that they're dealing with. But we're pushing these projects into a kind of resolution that is also, let's say, comfortable for these architects to respond with the tools of the architect. So we thought, and we realized, looking at these projects with the students, that there was a kind of merger of the sensitivities of these architects, but also their skills and their appetite for landscape that was very much linked also to, let's say, a capacity to react to these topographies. So as you see, most of the projects included in the book, but also that we looked, are not flat, and that sounds like a simple thing, but it's not. In terms to your question about Colombia, I guess I have to admit that when I started, I'm an architect, by the way, as I was introduced as a landscape architect. Well, it depends on who asks. Yeah, I guess I have to admit we were not that interested at that time in anthropology that much. I think, at least for me at that time, this was very much linked to postmodern architecture in a way. And it was really interesting to listen earlier, because I think it's a good time to revise this in the context of Latin America and away from how it has been, let's say, seen in other contexts. But anyway, this was not so much interesting to me. And I guess what was interesting to me and a few of my friends at that time was a very direct connection to the natural sciences that we thought could be a way to sidestep a kind of formal education in landscape architecture that we, frankly, at that time, we didn't have access to. So landscape schools and landscape programs perhaps were more developed in other countries in the region, but not so much in Colombia at that time. So it started with curiosity, but also simply with need to find alliances and other professionals, in this case, biologists, botanists, that could help us work with this media. So it was a very direct link with the sciences in that regard. That's how I think it started, at least for my generation. And that's also what I wrote in the text, for example, about the work of Felipe Mesa, as an example, in Colombia.
Yes, I remember that, and his collaboration with biologists, and it was very clear also in the drawings and in the conversations we had with Charles also at the end of the book, to try to understand some common ground in Latin America. You were focused very much on representation and how it plays a role in understanding landscape in our region. Would you like to comment about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, this is linked to the previous question, which is that we needed to develop a kind of language that was shared with not only with other architects and students that also we were invited to work with us, but also with botanists and scientists and biologists. And I think it has this has kind of two sides. On the one hand, it's of course the powerful aesthetics of just involving material that is alive into the representation of architecture, or let's say inert material, but also simply that these drawings became ways to be able to communicate with these people that we wanted to work with. So, for example, in my case, I remember painfully trying to develop drawings that will allow me to speak with my co-workers at that time at the Botanical Garden, when I was in my first job as an architect, a landscape architect in the Medellin Botanical Garden. So I had to show drawings to the people at the herbarium or the scientific staff of the garden. And it was not as simple as just showing and printing AutoCAD plans and sections. So there is a kind of, I would say, genuinely, there is a desire for perspective drawings and even very simple AutoCAD drawings at that time to be able to serve as tools to communicate with these scientific staff. But again, as I said, this was also emerging in a context where this was the way to sidestep, let's say, a formal education.
Yes, I think in a way, those drawings also are covering the voids or the things for which we cannot find the words sometimes. So when something is redefining or needs redefinition, sometimes certain new words, or that's also the idea of NESS, trying to reinvent language in a way, or the need for drawings or a new language for landscape or architecture are like pointing out new necessities and a world that is changing and it's transforming. And I think it's kind of accurate to talk about that at this particular moment of time. Cities and landscape are missing us as we are missing the city in many of the cities in we are right now based. And I was listening to the panel and listening to Eliza Silva saying or understanding this idea of the project and celebrating the city in a way. And I think this is also an opportunity to rethink about these concepts a little bit further. So do you think that the cities and in Latin America can be differentiated from nature, and can nature be differentiated from what is going on these days?
This is a very difficult question because on the one hand, very important thinkers are today rejecting the idea of nature. And this has been going on for a while. And let's say I am empathic to this. On the other hand, you have a continent where there might be some of the most valuable, almost untouched environments, especially when you compare with other areas of the world. By the way, something very similar happens here in Norway, where I live now. That some areas of the country are considered some of the last wilderness of Europe. So it's a similar issue. So I think when things get interesting is when these discussions about the nature, or whether it's the Amazon, for example, which, as María said or described very well, is actually urbanized and all that. When this sensitivity permeates the way in which we act in cities. So when the same designers that are thinking about the Amazon and thinking about ways of living of indigenous communities and are perhaps doing research on that area are at the same times acting in very urban environments of very large cities. So I think this is something very healthy that I think has a quite bright future, which is that I'm not completely sure that the project should happen in the Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
I think it is good to look at it. And I am completely sure that it's very good to look at it in academia and in research. And hopefully the architects or landscape architects that act in cities are also the same, so are looking at these specific landscapes.
Great. And there's a question from Zoe Latham that says, what modes of architectural representation can be adapted to visualize the complexity of ranging scale, body to territory of our understanding of landscape urbanism? Would you mind elaborating on this?
Bridging scales, that's what I got.
Yeah, so can you see the question and answer?
But I think I got it. It's if it's about bridging scales, I think, and this is also something that I argue in one of the texts, and this is not only about my practice, I think this is something that perhaps it's fair to say about Latinness in general as a design culture, that I think that there is a kind of very beautiful skill of using geometry at different scales in Latin practices. And this is something that, by the way, I think it's also to some extent underexplored. I don't think there are many scholars or designers that I know looking at this, but whether you look at the work of modern architects like Rogerio Salmona or Pablo or Lina Bobardi, or some contemporary offices that are involved in both very small scale works and at the same time also engage in the design of master plans and landscapes. And the way, and this might happen in other parts of the world, but I think when you look at how they react to projects with geometry, you find some of the same geometries in the larger scale works and the small scale works. So I think this is related to what Charles was saying about Latin America in the beginning, that yes, it is a continent predominantly where the strong architect has designed from the chair to the master plan. But I think the specific difference perhaps with North America especially is this kind of daring attitude to respond with geometry at different scales that I think we observe in many of these practices. This, by the way, we also look at as part of the seminar.
That's great. Charles, would you like to jump in as a way also to close this dialogue a little way and celebrate, because our conversation in the publication was like a very good end, and I think we can have a small representation of that here and then invite all the contributors to put on their cameras and just toast.
No, Florencia, I think you've done it quite beautifully. It's just so nice to have it now, and it kind of speaks for itself. No, I think it's to your credit and to the work of Mercedes and Jeannette and everyone involved. It's really been a very pleasant 5 years, a kind of great organic learning process. It's, on the one hand, a great pleasure that I get to benefit from the knowledge of everyone assembled here. So thank you all for indulging us in this way. And yeah, please do visit us in Cambridge next year when we can travel again.
We hope so. We are all looking forward to that. There are so many pending conversations that I hope we keep on exploring, both personally, in conferences, in publications, in interviews. And I think it's really important for the world right now and for Latin Americans as well to reinforce those channels for dialogues and to give new words or new forms of representation or new mediums to understand our spaces and how we inhabit them. Luis, would you like to close with some comments before we invite everybody to jump in?
And also to congratulate you and to congratulate all your team. It was an incredible exercise on also synthesizing this work that has happened, I guess now 5-6 years. So
Yes.
congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you, and I want to invite all the panelists. There are many of the contributors and practices represented in the issue of NESS that are here with us now. It's been an incredible journey, and I hope it's a beginning. So, I don't know, I'm looking for a glass here.
I would say, Florencia, also thanks for the videos. I mean, Magda, obviously you guys have been working very hard. I mean, I'll be interested in people's feedback about the format, but from my point of view, the idea of being able to put into these media, you know, so many stories, for me has been very, very powerful.
Well, thank you. There are a few more left, so
yeah, the videos are really good. It has been amazing to see all these multiple voices.
Yes. Great. So, I don't know, just let's have a toast here. Thank you all for collaborating. It's super nice to see now all the gallery view with all the people here. I see so many familiar faces, and as I was saying before, this continuous conversation in time that started years ago, and I hope it keeps on going. It's only possible because of these chances to get together and to find excuses to think, rethink, and to propose. So thank you, and
cheers
for joining us today. Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers. And
Thank
thanks
you very
also
much.
to Marilyn Monroe and Jacques Cousteau for joining. You know, it's not every day.
Congratulations, really, Florencia. It was amazing, the whole team. And I just want to, I agree with Charles. I think that the videos in between were great, short, precise, and it was great to learn more about, since I don't have the magazine yet,
yes.
learn more about the different practices.
Thank you. Natalia and Magda that are all there are responsible for putting all of that together, and it was amazing. So thank you. I can thank you now. Okay, so let's see the last videos, and I hope to see you soon personally.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Florencia.
Thank you.
Thank you so
everyone.
much.
Yes.
Thank you. Great seeing you all.
Thank you. Congratulations to everyone.
I'm Diego Barajas from Usos, a practice of architecture that I started together with Camilo Garcia in 2003 between Spain and Colombia. About this question on the urban, it would be worth to remember that in one hand, Latin America is the region with the highest percentage of people living in cities. Actually, there are more than 80% of people living in cities in Latin America, cities that actually are continuously growing. On the other hand, territories like the tropical Andes region constitute one of the most biodiverse places on Earth. Nevertheless, today is a biodiversity that is threatened and, according to different studies, is in decline, largely because of current urbanization processes. This enormous pressure that the urban puts on nature is explained partly by the fact that cities in the Andes region are often next to natural hotspots, because historically people has been looking for areas rich in natural resources like other species do. So in front of this context, in our office, we have been exploring from almost 2 decades other forms of urbanism from an approach that tries to be non-anthropocentric, multimedia, and interdisciplinary. The example that we present in this issue of NESS It's a project that is about a series of actions in which we use different media, like, for example, leaflets with seeds, or eco-social fashion catwalks, or workshops together with neighbors. And all these articulated around the design of a building, which is a host and nectar garden building. So through this set of mediations and through this building, we have been trying for 15 years with a community of neighbors to facilitate the work of what we used to call a network of environmentally responsible gardener citizens in Cali, trying to explore ways for reconnecting this Colombian city with its biodiversity.
Nos interesa la ciudad como escenario de un desarrollo humano eficiente y de bajo impacto ambiental. En este sentido, en los últimos años en Latinoamérica se han dado desplazamientos de la idea de ciudad-suburbio a la idea de ciudad compacta, de mediana densidad, que puede invertir más concentradamente en sus infraestructuras, transportes y espacios públicos. Plaza Jusey fue un proyecto con mucho potencial para articular estas reflexiones. La ley que guiaba el concurso era una buena base de acción porque consideraba una disminución de cantidad de estacionamientos, potenciando la peatonalización de la ciudad, e incorporaba programas para fomentar el uso de la plaza a todas horas. El proyecto, en síntesis, busca activar todas las condiciones de gran riqueza urbana preexistentes en el lugar. Incorpora actividades sin perder un solo metro cuadrado de espacio público de calidad.
Las conferencias de Landscape as Urbanism han confirmado la necesidad de exponer y discutir la riqueza existente de prácticas de diseño en el continente americano, sobre todo aquellas que utilizan el paisaje como medio alternativo a modelos urbanos prevalentes y las que promueven beneficios a la esfera de lo público. En Ground Lab buscamos nuevas formas de practicar el diseño y de contribuir a imaginar, desarrollar e implementar futuros alternativos a la crisis climática, la injusticia social, la relación con la naturaleza y los sistemas racistas que dominan las estructuras de la sociedad contemporánea y en particular en Latinoamérica. Por eso entender el origen y la forma en la que operan los paisajes, ya sean urbanos, rurales, productivos, planetarios, es fundamental para imaginar alternativas. En Ground Lab creemos en una colaboración cercana con otras disciplinas, con ciencias sociales, con ciencias naturales, ciencias políticas y con modelos económicos justos. No pensamos que el diseño por sí mismo salvará al mundo, pero sí que nuestras colaboraciones con otras disciplinas colectivamente pueden desencadenar cambios e impactos relevantes para un futuro más justo y sostenible que el actual. Poder imaginar, visualizar, espacializar esos futuros es fundamental y el diseño desde la mirada crítica y transdisciplinar puede aportar mucho.
Hello, I'm Eliza Silva, Principal of NESS Arquitectura in Caracas, Venezuela. A significant part of our practice focuses on the built environment of barrios, or informal settlements. Public space and services are aspects that tend to be scarce and insufficient, and there are no established or official methods for incorporating them into barrios. It's actually an opportunity for designers to give these spatial forms a process and an economic base. We have, for example, helped communities convert open-air waste areas into public space, parking lots into children's playgrounds, and helped improve the quality of waste collection so that it's comparable to that of the rest of the city. The projects go beyond a physical design and require getting everybody on board, securing funding, procuring the construction process, and other aspects. So it is very important to make these stories known so that they can become more pervasive and embraced by both the public and private sector.